Go.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Dynasty Dudez Hangout. We don't actually number ours like some cool kids at RotoViz Radio, so we have no idea what number we're on. But we're joined today.
See, but here at the Dudes, we give like ranges, so it's like between episode 30 and like 75 or somewhere around that area.
Yeah, it's just an ADP. I think you can call this like episode alpha if you want.
So that's our guest, Matthew Freedman. He's a writer for RotoViz, and he's a podcaster for RotoViz Radio. And what's your new one again?
The Numbers Game.
The Numbers Game.
All right, so we're joined by Matt today. We're going to be talking a lot about metrics and a lot of the stuff that RotoViz does, and especially some of the stuff that he's focused on. So let's start off with just the first thing when I went down your author page at RotoViz was the Dissenting Costanzan. I am one of the world's biggest Seinfeld fans, so I was like, wow, this is awesome. Let's talk about this. What is that series? And, just highlight some of the players you've done recently with it.
Sure. So the Dissenting Costanzan, I think it's been around for about a year, and I put them out sporadically. And really, the idea behind it is that there are a lot of kind of diverse opinions within the RotoViz community, and almost as a way of kind of having some sort of not quality control, but a way of if someone puts an idea that's out there, and there could maybe be a differing perspective that we want the RotoViz community to get, I would have this way of putting that information out there, and it's what would be sort of state-sanctioned bro-on-bro violence or something like that. But a way of kind of thinking like, you know what, there might be an alternate perspective that could be equally RotoViz, but would provide a different take on this player. So one of the guys I've highlighted recently is Vince Mail out of Washington State. And there could be a variety of reasons why people would or wouldn't like him, but he's a player I've highlighted recently, and then Dorial Green-Beckham is another guy.
Awesome. And yeah, it's a very interesting concept of checks and balances that I don't think I've really ever seen that before. I mean, I've probably read one or two before, but I don't think anyone's done a series on like contrarian views of their own site. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's very RotoViz, and we were trying to think of a name, like a name that would kind of give like very quickly an idea of what you might expect, and even somehow I forget something like I think Frank had mentioned, Frank DuPont, or AKA Fantasy Douche, the founder of the site. He had mentioned wanting to have something that people would think of as contrarian, but would be very straightforward, something that could appeal to even like the George Costanzas. And so that was kind of how it started brewing.
Which is literally the toughest demo to like appease.
Right.
All right, so then another one of your pieces on RotoViz is the workhorse metric. It was definitely something that caught my eye. Talk a little bit about the workhorse metric and how it can be used for dynasty owners.
Sure. So one of the ideas at RotoViz that's become pretty prevalent is instead of looking at raw production, looking at the percentage production that a guy accumulated within his offense. So the standard for this is wide receivers, dominator rating. If a guy gets 50% of his receiving production, that actually might be, but he gets only 1,000 receiving yards. That actually might be more impressive than a guy who has like 1,500 receiving yards, like Michael Crabtree or something, but only had like 25% of his team's receiving production. So the workhorse metric really takes this kind of market share or like percentage of offense approach to the running back position, but it also seeks to take into account things like injuries. It factors out the quarterback rushing production. Like a guy who's on a team with a running quarterback, I kind of don't think he should be punished just because his quarterback happens to run for 1,000 yards, someone like Cam Newton. It factors in game flow. So, for instance, in a blowout, you have lots of second and third string running backs that get touchdowns, and they get a lot of their rushing production in those games. But that production actually really isn't significant in terms of what the rushing production means for that team kind of over the course of the season. So the workhorse metric it's not a perfect metric by any means, but it's an attempt to tap into this idea of running back market share and to take into account injuries, game flow, quarterback position, offensive system, all of those different factors. And so the way that I use it for Dynasty, I don't use it so much for the guys in the first and the second round, although it does have some applicability there. Where it really seems to pay off is on those late round guys. Guys like Michael Turner, who had really high market share, but also LeGarrette Blount, Ben Jarvis Green Ellis, Danny Woodhead, Alfred Morris was a superstar when it came to the workhorse metric. So these guys, Amon Bradshaw, guys who you can find in the late round, and what I found is that the workhorse metric provides a greater, I guess, stratification than if you just look at the raw production that those guys got. So there are a lot of late round running backs who on a point per game basis look fairly similar to the first and second round running backs. And so you can't really distinguish the guys who break out from the guys who don't. But the late round running backs who have high workhorse scores, those guys have a much higher chance of breaking out than the guys who are in their peer group have just kind of like mediocre workhorse scores. So that's I like to target those late round running backs using the workhorse metric.
And for those of you that haven't been to RotoViz before, you basically go on there and fall down the rabbit hole of just article, and then
Totally.
there's this sidebar at the end of every article of like other articles that might appeal to you. And then, like last night, I was on there for probably 2 to 3 hours of just like, oh my god, like how is this happening right now? Because you read one, and then it's like they're all connected in this spider web.
No, it's definitely a rabbit hole. It is.
And it's pretty fun to check out. The workhorse metric I thought was really cool. I like how in the article you basically broke it down to like you found a criteria of where you found like some solid results, like the later round guys, and then you broke it down into sort of like you broke it down into a range of players that you think this could be really helpful for, and that's exactly what I like doing with the end of the roster type players.
Right.
You find a range of players you like, and then try to buy them in bulk and hope one hits. So I was really in on that idea. I thought that was really cool.
Nice.
So who from that metric study, is there any guys that like are like high ADP guys or something that you come away and say, okay, I'm fading this guy because he doesn't come out favorably with this? So the opposite of targeting, you know.
Sure. So, well, again, a way of thinking about this, a lot of the first, second, and even the third round running backs are guys who come from those bigger conferences, so the SEC or the Big Ten, the Big 12. And so on a lot, especially the SEC, a lot of those teams, they always have more than one good runner. And so it makes sense. So like think of the guys from Alabama. None of those guys have really high workhorse scores because they are always splitting carries with another guy who will be in the NFL in a couple of years.
Right. Some highly touted 5-star recruit that just came in. Yeah.
Exactly. And so with those guys, I don't hold lower workhorse scores against them because the context makes sense. But to kind of flip the question, what I really like seeing is one of those first or second round guys who has a super high workhorse score. So like Le'Veon Bell, his was I think around 94%, right? So for the workhorse metric, it's not so much that if a high round guy has a bad score that I hold that against him, but if a high round guy has an outrageous score, that seems to be, for me at least, the distinguisher between him and other guys that are in a similar draft range. So Le'Veon Bell kind of versus other guys who were in his class like Eddie Lacy, and I think Eddie Lacy's been great, but I think Le'Veon Bell is just a step above him.
So how would you evaluate Todd Gurley's junior year? Because would you just take the games he played in
Yes.
And okay, because
Yeah.
obviously if you look at end of year totals, it's going to be all screwed up. But
Right. So the workhorse metric is something that factors out injuries. So games that
right.
a guy missed because of injury, those don't count. And if there's a game in which a guy kind of started but got injured and he didn't play most of that game, that is a game that could also be factored out. So Todd Gurley was routinely in the 60 to 70% range of offensive production. And that's not super high, but for the SEC and for a guy who was doing that at 18 years old as a true freshman, that's pretty good.
Mhm.
So that's something that I don't expect to see SEC rushers with a 90% in the workhorse metric. That just doesn't happen unless, of course, you're Marcus Lattimore. And that did happen
Uh,
for him. And he would have, I mean, that's like one of the saddest stories. He could have been an all-time great. Just, the two knee injuries.
it's really that sharp of a way to be out of the NFL. It's like that razor thin,
Yeah.
Well, I had. How did Melvin Gordon and Tevin Coleman turn out in that workhorse metric?
Sure. So Melvin Gordon is just a touch under 80%, which is respectable. And then I think Melvin Gordon was in the mid 70s. Sorry. Tevin Coleman was in the mid 70s. And
Right.
so Melvin Gordon, here's the thing, and it's like a bias of origin or something. I'm fading him in part just because of the Wisconsin thing. I think a lot of his production was inflated because of that great offensive line.
Oh,
And
definitely inflated.
and I think
Absolutely.
if you had put Tevin Coleman behind that offensive line, or conversely, if you had put Melvin Gordon behind Indiana's offensive line, we would have seen very different results. So I prefer Tevin Coleman, if anything, in part because of his fantastic athleticism. He's not a big guy. He's a mid-sized running back, but the history of mid-sized running backs who have that great athleticism, that great 40 time, those guys, especially drafted in that range, they tend to do pretty well. So I think of him as kind of like a bigger Jamal Charles or a slightly smaller DeMarco Murray. I think there are people who say that he's not a good scheme fit for what's happening in Atlanta for the zone blocking scheme, and that might be true. But I think just the history of running backs that Kyle Shanahan has had, I like Tevin Coleman's chances. And so the mixture of college production and what I think of as being inflated statistics because of the Wisconsin offense, and then also their difference in athletic profiles, that for me makes me prefer Tevin Coleman.
Yeah, that's where I'm at with Coleman as well, and I guess I could see parts of his game that maybe you don't like, but in general, when someone puts up that prolific of a season, I feel like you got to give him the benefit of the doubt. But
Right, especially in that horrible offense.
yeah,
It was a bad offense.
it was incredible what he was doing, even against really good competition. So, I
Right.
mean, he had, I think it was sort of sheltered by all the great running back seasons of 2014, but it really was one of the better running back seasons since 2000, Um,
Certainly.
so I don't know. I'm obviously in on him.
Right.
So I'm gonna make sure I understood you correctly. So Tevin Coleman, is he your RB2 as far as this class in Dynasty?
Yeah, it's an embarrassing thing to say because everyone has Melvin Gordon above him, and I feel like I'm kind of out there on an island. But yeah, I have Todd Gurley 1, and I have Tevin Coleman 2, and I'm much higher on Coleman than I am on. Let me rephrase that. I am much higher on Coleman than most other people in the Dynasty community.
Yeah.
So I think Coleman is rarer than someone like. I hate to say Amari Cooper, but I think he's rarer than someone like Devontae Parker or someone like Nelson Aguilar. So I have him above those guys. I should say I haven't had yet a pick that high where I would actually have to kind of put it out there and take Coleman over those other guys. But I value Coleman very much.
Yeah, I just think this is a great year for running backs, and because of all the wide receiver success the last few years, people are very hesitant to believe in running backs. But based on everything I'm looking at, I feel like this is going to be a great class, and they all have pretty solid opportunities. So I have Coleman as my number three, and I do think it's closer than people think between him and Gordon. I do like Gordon more, but I think it's really close. So.
Right, and just to go off of that, I think it is a great class. I think it's not quite in that 2008 range, which was a fantastic class.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty good, and I think there will be guys that are in that third and fourth round range, not only in the NFL draft, but guys who slip into the third or fourth round of your rookie draft that you can get who will end up being valuable producers in a couple of years.
Yeah, that 2008 class didn't really come to fruition. I think the best guy ended up being Matt Forte, but when you think about McFadden and Jonathan Stewart, like what could have been with that class?
That's true, but you also have you have Ray Rice, who had a couple of great seasons. You have Jamal Charles, who was drafted in the third round, who had that fantastic season 2 years ago, but who's been consistently, I think, a top 6 runner since he became a starter, minus that season he missed with his ACL injury. And then I also really think that Steve Slayton could have been something, but you can't discount a guy who was a top 6 running back as a rookie. Like that's immediate production that could win leagues for you. And then, of course, you can get into the later rounds, and you can see that Tim Hightower had some production there. And Peyton Hillis had that one fantastic season. And then even this year you had Justin Forsett, who kind of like years after finally ended up paying off. And so it's a class that kind of continues randomly to pay dividends. But those guys drafted in the top 100, some of those guys are still valuable pieces today on championship-winning dynasty teams.
Oh, absolutely. I wasn't taking anything away from the class. I was more talking about that was a great class, and the best guys coming into it didn't even necessarily hit.
That's true.
The crazy part.
That's very true. McFadden has been a McMisery, really.
He had that 1 year that I'll always hold tight to, but other than that, it was just like wow. And then,
it's a year in which there's been so much production, but you don't even kind of know what else could have been.
That's what I mean. Guys,
like Rashard Mendenhall was in that class.
Yeah.
He had some fantastic production and then fell off a cliff. So it's a question of if these other guys could have lived up to their potential, how fantastic would that class have been? And I think it's already kind of an all-time running back class, but it could have been amazing.
Yeah. So that's how I want to look at the 2014 class. Obviously, some are going to get derailed by injury. Obviously, some are going to have bad situation. But this is a good running back class, and some of these guys are going to be good fantasy contributors. So don't be afraid of running back just because of the last four years or so.
Right.
So one of the things that RotoViz is well known for with their metrics is a lot of the age stuff that John Moore has done.
Yes.
And we talk a lot about age with him when he was on a couple months ago. But just talk about how you view age, especially with the rookies, the incoming rookies, as well as the sophomores, named the Kelvin Benjamins of the world.
Kelvin Benjamin, yeah. So I should say I think John's work with age has been fantastic. I think it's trailblazing. And then you have what has been, I think, an amendment to that work in Sean Siegel's focus on breakout age. And so I think that's also really valuable to think not only what are these guys doing at certain ages in college, but when was their first season really to become a stud. And I think those two factors are predictive. Now, what I would say for someone like Kelvin Benjamin, there are players that I think don't fit as cleanly into the age-adjusted metrics, and I think Kelvin Benjamin is one of those guys because he was older when he entered college, and he had only 2 years of playing experience. And I think someone like John Brown, who entered the NFL, or who played as a 24-year-old rookie, I think he would be another one of those guys because he's a little bit older but played only 4 seasons. And so I think one of the things that I would want to focus on, in addition to adjusting for age, is also adjusting for experience. So, for instance, if Kelvin Benjamin played only 2 seasons in college, but he's 22 in his final season, should you be comparing him to guys who have played 4 seasons and who are 22, or guys who have played only 2 seasons and who are 20? And I think the answer is probably some combination of both. So I think that I think really the next step is to continue to adjust for age, but also to incorporate experience-adjusted production. And so that is kind of where my focus is right now, and I'm starting to take the steps of thinking about theories of adjusting for age and adjusting for experience.
And that's where I saw this headed from the beginning, when I saw you guys starting to work on the age type stuff. I mean, even in the Devi community, just a general rule from day one has been, like, if a true freshman breaks out, and that's like a huge plus. Like, I don't even care if it's a lower level. It's like Amari Cooper's the perfect example. Like, everyone was like, holy crap, like, this guy's a true freshman and he's doing this year. And same with AJ Green, same with Julio Jones. And that's factored in, even like subconsciously, to people that watch the sport. You know, when a young kid's coming in at that age, that's a really impressive thing. One of the things you talked about. Go ahead.
Sorry, if I could just jump in there. And so to think about someone like Amari Cooper, he's a fantastic example, because he's a guy where the age and the experience line up perfectly. So he's an 18-year-old true freshman.
Right.
Now, and the same thing with Todd Gurley, 18-year-old true freshman. Now, but if you want to kind of extend that to think about how experience factors into this, you could look at someone like Michael Dyer, who broke out as a freshman at Auburn, but who was a 20-year-old true freshman, which is insane. It's super old for a true freshman. And so, but there'd be the question of, as a 20-year-old true freshman, does he, like, to whom should he be compared? Should he be compared to, like, the 18-year-old true freshman, or the 19-year-old redshirt freshman, or the 20-year-old true junior? Right? There are all of these kind of questions about, like, how should you, in which context should you place this guy's production? And so that is where I'm kind of trying to insert this question of experience-adjusted production and align it or combine it with what we already have existing in the age-adjusted conversation.
That's where I was going next, actually. The difference between a 20-year-old true freshman, there's a guy coming in this year that'll be a good case study, and his name is Calvin Ridley. I think he's going to Alabama. Okay, first of all, how do these guys go into college at 20 years old for the first time? Do they go to, like, prep school or something? Because there's quite a few of them. I don't really know how it works.
Yeah, they get held back a year really young,
or something.
And then they were kind of already on that cusp, so they turn 20 kind of like right as they're entering college.
Right.
It's a weird thing, but it's a little more common than you would think.
And one of the things you touch on in your articles are sort of the cognitive progression at those ages. We don't really think of, like, once you get to 18, we think of you as an adult, but really your brain isn't done fully developing until you're like 25, both in a maturity standpoint and just a development. Like, you're still growing, you're still a kid, so there's a lot of room for sort of moving, and the more time you have in that area, the better, you know?
Right. Yeah. And there's also one more thing to add into this, is the question of how to think about guys who have redshirted for a year.
Yeah.
And also, like, why they've redshirted. If it's like a medical redshirt and they can't really work out, they can't train, then I think that's different than thinking about a guy who redshirted when he just entered college, but he still had that year to learn the offense, to build his body, to work out with his teammates, and to kind of become a college student, right? And so that doesn't kind of factor into the way that people normally think about experience. They think about kind of on-field experience, but I think that redshirt season also needs to be factored in some way. So whether you
Yeah.
count a guy who's a redshirt junior, you think of him as like having a year and a half of experience or whatever it is. I think there also needs to be a way of thinking about these guys who have been on campus and who have been learning and building their bodies, but who haven't actually seen action on the field.
And like you mentioned before when you were describing something else, it's not necessarily a knock, but if you have that breakout true freshman year, it's a really good thing, you know?
Of course, yeah.
So,
right. It's one of those distinguishing factors.
Right. That pretty much all the top wide receiver prospects that have come out the past few years have had. So.
Yeah,
right.
and there's a reason when you look at Devy, obviously the players who play the best, those are the guys who need the high Devy picks. But if a guy has an extremely great freshman season, he's going to be the 101, 102 Devy if he was selected in his freshman year to begin with.
Right.
And I do slightly knock a player if he breaks out in his red shirt versus true. I just think the true freshman year is like huge, like we were talking about.
It's more valuable. It's a guy who can come in right away, absorb the offense. Physically, his body is mature enough to take the pressure, to take the pounding of playing against guys who have been in college for multiple years and have kind of built their bodies into something like approaching like pro bodies instead of like high school bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely. It's really impressive when a guy breaks out as a true freshman.
Yeah.
All right. So another thing with the whole metrics point of view that I kind of think of a lot is like you're kind of like checking boxes. Like you check the height box, you check the weight box. You check all these things, age, breakout age, all these things. Is there one that like okay, if he's missing just this one, I mean, obviously you don't want to have just like okay, he doesn't have this one thing, so he's not good. But of all of those, is there one that's like, oh, I'm fading this guy. I like a lot of these things, but there's just one thing that I just can't look over. Is there one?
Yeah, I don't know if this necessarily addresses what you're talking about, but it's production. Yeah. So for instance, I can live with a guy who's big and not that fast if he had the college production, and assuming he's drafted, in like the top half of the draft or something like that. I can live with a guy who's not that big, but who's fast and has the college production. But if there's a guy who didn't have the college production, he is automatically on my fade list because you can pretty clearly draw like a line in the sand that separates the guys who have NFL success from the guys who don't. And when you take into account draft position or adjust for draft position, that line basically comes down to college production. And so if a guy wasn't productive, so like Chris Conley is kind of, I think, like the typical guy to think about for this year. He has good draft position. Athletically, he's a marvel. Like the guy is unreal as like an athletic specimen. But as a producer in college, he never had more than 45 receptions in a year. He never had more than 8 touchdowns. I don't think he got much more than 600 receiving yards or so. Even though he led this year his offense in receiving, he's not a guy who has the metrics that would make you believe he can be a success in the NFL moving forward. So for me, that one metric is production. And there are different ways of looking at production. Obviously, you can adjust for age. You can look at the raw stats. I'm one of the weird guys at RotoViz who kind of, it's not that I prefer the raw stats to the metrics like market share, but I like to look at both of them. And so if a guy, for instance, if a guy in the third round at some point didn't have a season in which he had, like 10 touchdowns and 1,000 scrimmage yards, the odds of him doing something in the NFL are pretty low. And you could also look at market share and kind of break it down. But for me, the quick and dirty way is to look at a guy. Did he have a season in which he had 10 touchdowns and 1,000 scrimmage yards? If the answer is no, then he's probably not going to be a guy with success in the NFL.
And this is sort of how I break it down. I try to make it as simple as possible when I first start evaluating a class. And Chris Conley was one of the examples of where these guys are all the best players, or they should be. Like the top NFL receivers were all the top receivers like on their team. Like they should be a dominant college football player, you know?
Right.
And when you look at sort of the top 20 to 30 like dynasty receivers, AJ Green's really the only one that didn't have 1,000-yard receiving season, you know?
And the thing is, if you adjust for his final season, because he missed 4 games, the first 4 games of that season to suspension.
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah, so if you look at it on a per game basis and extrapolate it out, yeah, he hit those metrics. He would have easily had 1,000 receiving yards and 10 touchdowns.
Okay, so there you go. So there's that out, and the only other guy was Julian Edelman, who was a quarterback. So
And actually, and if you look at Julian Edelman, again, he had 1,000 rushing yards,
Yeah.
and he had 10 rushing touchdowns.
Exactly.
Like he still kind of hit that factor of having like
dominant college production.
Yeah, dominant college production that wasn't just throwing the ball.
Right.
Okay, along the lines of production, another thing that is interesting, like the number that was thrown around all last offseason was Odell Beckham only had 2 SEC touchdowns. You know, how do you factor in strength of schedule as far as playing in the MAC versus playing in the SEC, or production versus the SEC versus production, versus everybody else? Is that something you look at all, or has Odell Beckham just trashed that thing?
Yeah, I don't look at it anymore. No, no. Man, and so the thing with Odell Beckham, it's really interesting. So I have a pretty straightforward system through which I initially rank wide receivers, and so Odell Beckham, it just by my system was in the top 3, and then I manually adjusted him down to number 7.
You went in, you're like, you scratched, you whited it out. You're like, no.
Because I know better than the numbers, So no, but I think it's a question of sample size, and so the larger sample size with Odell Beckham gave you a guy who had pretty good market share production of his receiving production for the team, and then who also had pretty good, or I wouldn't say fantastic, but good enough raw production. He had over 1,000 receiving yards, and he had 9 total touchdowns on the season. For a guy who gets drafted in the first round, that's good enough, especially when you take into account his athletic profile. And so I think but if you had just kind of done a subsection of his games and looked at how did he do in the blowouts versus how did he do in the non-blowouts, you would have gotten a different picture. And ultimately, I think the error that I made and that other RotoViz writers made in looking at Odell Beckham was focusing on the smaller sample of games. And I think moving forward, it's always a question of what means more, this larger sample of games or the smaller sample of games. And I think we have more work to do on figuring out the exact significance of different types of games. The strength of schedule is important, but I wouldn't knock a guy necessarily who accumulated still a lot of production, even if a chunk of it came against schools that were clearly inferior and that were getting blown out.
Yeah, I guess you could say Odell Beckham broke that code, but I still take it into account quite a bit. It'll probably bite you every once in a while. Like, I did that with Le'Veon Bell, and obviously didn't look at the athletic profile, and I was low on him because, he didn't have good yards per carry in the big, against good teams, and I, ran with that one. And obviously, that one bit me hard. But I think, in general, as we said, the best players, if they're really that good, will dominate good competition in college. They're going to be better than people in college. So I still take it into account. I'm not going to let one guy like that change the entire way I view it,
No, I mean, it's true. And Odell Beckham, even though he checks the boxes, he is still such an outlier in many ways. So I mean, and it reminds me of people who would build kind of projection models trying to find the next Tom Brady or something like that. It's not, you don't build your system around finding the outliers. You build your system on trying to eliminate as many kind of certain busts as possible and kind of moving forward from there.
Right, but I do think I wasn't that high on Odell Beckham either last year. I do think this emphasizes sort of evaluating the player individually at least a little bit. Sometimes I tend to look at the raw stats or just like a few highlights, and then I kind of I don't know. I just feel like focusing on the individual a little bit each time helps out and can sort of take away some of those errors.
Right, and one more thing. It's not as if this is like the answer, as in like, aha, I needed to pay attention to offensive coordinator.
Yeah.
But, Cam Cameron was the offensive coordinator for LSU in Odell Beckham's final season, and I don't know. Zach Mettenberger was quarterback. It's a question of like, were they even maximizing Odell Beckham's potential? Right. And I don't know if there's a way that we could have looked at what was happening and known. And I guess the film guys who had Odell Beckham number one be like, yes, there is a way we could have looked at the film more. Honestly, maybe they're right. But I think it's a question of, like, you can't always know if an offensive coordinator is maximizing the potential on his team the way that he should. And I would say with Odell Beckham, given what he was able to do as a rookie, I mean, he had an historic rookie season, right? So given what he was able to do as a rookie, I think we can look back and say, you know what, Cam Cameron might be like the worst decent offensive coordinator in college football.
A good example of this and sort of showing how fragile what we have to go on and evaluate is, like, the USC, when Robert Woods and Marquise Lee were there at the same time, it came out after that basically all the coaches love Marquise Lee, and even though Woods might have been the better player, like, their game plan was just to force feed Lee targets that entire year. And they talked openly about it, or one of the guys that was on the staff talked about it openly after the year was over, like that was their goal. And so that kind of hindered Robert Woods the rest of his career, And that's something that, how could you possibly, both on film and sort of, like, I don't know how you could possibly evaluate that,
Right.
So.
All right, so going back to the checking boxes, you might have talked about it while I'm having all sorts of technical difficulties today. But with Kevin White, he does check the speed box, he checks the height box, the weight box. But as far as the production, it's only 1 year, and he's also older than my grandma. So what are your thoughts on Kevin White?
It doesn't bother me. And so it's one of those instances where, so he played at junior college. And although the raw stats he had in his one season at junior college weren't great, by Dominator rating, they were actually pretty decent. And so I think if you kind of think of a guy, and this is also similar to what Vince Mayle did, except Vince Mayle also had really awesome raw junior college stats. But a guy who played for 1 year at junior college and then had only 2 seasons in kind of like the big time of major college football. It doesn't bother me that it took him a year to adjust moving from junior college, when he did well at junior college, to Western Virginia. And so if you think that in his second year of Western Virginia, which just happened to be his final college season, he had a great season, then I think it kind of changes the way that you look at him, as opposed to a guy who didn't have his true breakout season kind of until he was like 22 or something like that. I think the context with him matters a little more than if he were someone who had been at Western Virginia for like 4 years and then didn't break out. Someone like Terrence Williams at Baylor, who was like a redshirt senior who didn't break out until his senior year. That is different than someone like Kevin White, who had a journey to get to Western Virginia and then was there only 2 years. And so you could look at the raw stats and say he didn't really break out until his senior year, but one that's not totally true because I think you could count his junior season. Sorry, not his junior season. His junior college season where he had good good dominator rating. I think you could count that as a breakout. But then I think you could also see this is the guy who in only his second year of kind of quote-unquote like real college football was able to break out. I think that changes the context a little bit.
So switch it up a little bit here. How do you evaluate the guys like Devin Smith and Philip Dorsett who like had unreal efficiency per catch, but don't like? I had trouble. Like I didn't expect them to get drafted as high as they did, and it kind of made me go back and reevaluate how I looked at like seniors with weirdly efficient production. Like I had kind of had to change how I did things there. What did you think of those two?
And okay, so I was never really all that. Okay, so Devin Smith had the reputation of being the speed merchant, which is not the case. He's fast enough for his size, but he's not a blazer the way that he was being hyped.
No.
And so again, he was able to score a lot of touchdowns on not many receptions. I think it's a question as to how replicatable that is in the NFL.
Right.
But with Dorsett, so he had the touchdowns, right? He had enough touchdowns. He's not a big guy, but he certainly had the speed, right? So physically, I'm fine with him, just like I'm fine with guys like T.Y. Hilton and John Brown. Like smaller guys who have great speed, I think those guys tend to be undervalued anyway. And so what I've noticed is that I have kind of different criteria for first-round wide receivers than I do for guys in the second and third rounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, for me, with those two guys, it was always a question of whether they would actually be first-round picks or not. And so if they snuck into the first round, they would be judged by a different set of criteria. And so now I freaking love Dorsett. Like the moment that pick was made, I fell in love with him. And it's from a multiple of perspectives, but think of it this way. So he is, of all of the receiving weapons that they have surrounded Andrew Luck with, so you think Kobe Fleener at the top of the second round, and then T.Y. Hilton in the third round, Dante Moncrief in the third round, even Dwayne Allen in the third round. Philip Dorsett is the highest drafted player that they have sought to partner with Andrew Luck.
Right.
And so at this point, I'm probably higher on Dorsett than I was before the draft, but higher on Dorsett than I think a lot of other people in the Dynasty community. And so much of it has to do with the fact that I think for a first-round pick, he's good enough athletically, he's good enough productively, and so much of it has to do with the situation of being partnered with Andrew Luck. And it's just a question of, like, are they going to use him as a kick returner his first year?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you know, if he gets kind of put into the Cordarrelle Patterson, like, pigeonhole, then obviously my drafting him as high as I am is a huge mistake. But otherwise, he's a guy that I like a lot now. But for guys like Dorsett and guys like Smith, it's always just a question of which round are they going to get drafted in, because they do have kind of not suspect, but they have questionable production.
Yeah.
And so if they go in that first round, it's a different set of criteria. It's a different game for first round wide receivers than it is for everybody else.
That's sort of how I looked at it, and I'm like, okay, well, he has Luck now, so I guess I'm buying him regardless of what I think of him as a player. But I'm wondering if it's a shift in the NFL that they value those speed deep threats more now, and they're going higher than they were before. But that just really shocked me based on what I'd looked at previously. So
yeah, I think there are teams that are starting to place more of an emphasis on those guys that can win down the field just based on their pure speed.
Yeah.
And so based on the research I've done, I've kind of seen that, and maybe this is kind of the distinction between guys who play like split end and guys who play flanker, right? But I found that once guys get to a certain size, and this is kind of like as long as they have the production and they have the
right.
As long as guys get to a certain size, their speed doesn't matter so much. So that's someone like Anquan Bolden or Keenan Allen or maybe even Jarvis Landry, right? But then also kind of on the flip side, going on the other end of the spectrum, once guys get to a certain speed, their size doesn't matter as much, right? And that could be someone like, I think the classic of this is someone like Deshaun Jackson, who's been in the league now for like 7 years. 6 of those years he's been a top 30 wide receiver. You know, he's not going to be like your consistent touchdown maker, but he serves a different role in the offense, right? And so I think there are teams that are starting to value guys. Maybe they're not big, but they're fast. And so the classic of this, I think, is someone like John Brown. Almost no one thought he could be a third-round pick, and then somehow he was a third-round pick, right?
Yeah.
But basically, he's T.Y. Hilton just on another team. And so I think that the league is starting to value a little bit more those guys who can serve a different function than just your prototypical big-bodied wide receivers. A classic guy like that, I think, for this class is Tyler Lockett from Kansas State. Smaller guy, but I think he has speed that's good enough, really comparable to T.Y. Hilton. And also has that fantastic college production. So he's a guy in the third round in that kind of prototypical small wide receiver mold that I would be going after.
So you
Interesting.
mentioned Devin Smith. He's a guy that I wasn't really like a super huge fan pre-draft, but him going at the top of the second round did catch my eye, and he ended up going like mid-late second in all of my rookie drafts. And this was after Dorsett, after Funchess, after a lot of these guys. And so I just thought this guy was highly drafted. He is a deep threat, and so he could be a fit on my fantasy team. But so I'm guessing because he just fell out of the first that he doesn't make the exception to the rule like Dorsett does, I guess.
Yeah, and it's always a question. So it's like if a guy is drafted at like the first pick of the second round, it's like well, for instance, someone like Brian Quick. But the thing is, Brian Quick hit all the criteria anyway. But so for me, I'm in on Dorsett and I'm out on Devin Smith, and it's maybe it's a rule that is a little too hard and fast for me. But just doing the historical research and looking at the distinction between first-rounders and second-rounders, so I guess I should say second-rounders are closer to first-rounders than they are to third-rounders. Yeah. But the second-rounders, still, I think there's a pretty big distinction between the production that you see out like in college and how that translates to the NFL. There's a distinction between the first and the second-round wide receivers. And so Devin Smith is a guy, for me, who just gets caught up in that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting stuff. So this may be a bit of a shift from what we're talking about. Dorial Green-Beckham,
yes.
What were your thoughts on him pre-draft, and how do you I know this isn't necessarily a metric question, but you personally, how do you evaluate risk in rookie drafts and in Dynasty in general?
Yeah, and so man, he's such an interesting test case.
And I've actually been like baiting him just because I don't know what to think,
Right, and so pre-draft, I think there were people who were looking at him in a way that kind of skewed the evaluation. And so obviously we have no idea of knowing what he would have done as a junior, right? But I think there were people who were looking at what he did as a 20-year-old sophomore and thinking of that as his final college season and trying to evaluate him on that instead of thinking of it as like his 20-year-old college season or his second college season and evaluating him in that way. And so basically I did one article where I looked at basically big-bodied wide receivers to be drafted in the top 4 rounds, and guys, and then evaluated that peer group on the basis of their 20-year-old season and their second college season. And so basically what I found, and this is a fantastic peer group, by the way, which has like all of the awesome big-bodied studs that are ruling the NFL now. And Dorial Green-Beckham, on the basis of what he did as a 20-year-old sophomore, he basically looked just like them. I mean, in terms of production. And then physically, of course, he's a freak in that he's big. And, like, Okay, there's only one Calvin Johnson. You can't expect a guy who's 239 pounds or in that range, who's really great athletically, to be able to run in the 4.3s. It's totally sufficient if he runs a sub 4.5. Okay, Dorial Green-Beckham, I think athletically he's a marvel, just not as marvelous as maybe like the greatest not Jerry Rice receiver of all time. So.
I think we will look down the road 20 to 30 years, and I really don't know that we're going to see a better receiver prospect, like a better one than what Calvin was.
Yeah, no, he was fantastic. But and so Dorial Green-Beckham on the pre-draft, I think he compared pretty well to this group of stud receivers. Like, he looked a lot like Mike Evans. If you look at kind of market share and what happened in their 20-year-old second season, right? Like, he fits in with this group. Now, and I should say he went in that general draft range of that peer group, so he still fits in. Now, the question is, how much do you trust Ken Wisenhunt? And I don't trust him at all.
No.
And then also, what do you think of Marcus Mariota, and will his career kind of go sideways based on Wisenhunt, and how much will that affect Dorial Green-Beckham? I hate the landing spot. I absolutely hate it. But I am still, if he's there in the second half of the first round, then it's the question, personally, am I going to draft him over someone like Philip Dorsett? Probably not, even though I like him more in some weird way. But draft position is the number one factor the number one factor that feeds into the predictiveness of future NFL success. And Dorsett was drafted higher and drafted to a much better position. So I'm at a point where if I'm sitting there with a pick in the bottom of the first round and Dorsett and Dorial Green-Beckham were both there, I'm taking Dorsett. But I like the idea of Dorial Green-Beckham in that he's this phenomenal athlete. I think he had enough production in his final season of college football, given that it wasn't supposed to be his final season. And I don't know. There are guys who can overcome circumstance, like Josh Gordon in Cleveland, or even Calvin Johnson, who was drafted by a horrible Detroit Lions team. Right? There are guys who can overcome circumstance, and so it just depends. Like, if you believe that maybe the situation in Tennessee isn't as bad as it seems, and especially if you believe in Marcus Mariota, I would do Dorial Green-Beckham. I'm still on him. It's just there are guys that have moved ahead because of circumstance, but I still like him. I really like him as a prospect, and if it's the right draft range and there aren't other players I prefer, then I would draft him.
The worst part about all of this is that any other team, and I'd be all in on this Mariota DGB combination. Like, I love that combination. I just am I'm worried about the Titans in general. Like, I don't know. I'm just fading that situation now, even though I really like Mariota. I think he's a really
I do too, and I think there is some underrated potential for this team. Yeah. I think Bishop Sankey is better than people think. But even if he's not,
I do too, yeah.
But even if he's not, I think David Cobb could do really well in that offense. And a guy who's kind of on the bottom of the roster, but Antonio Andrews, I think he could do pretty well in that offense too, especially as a receiver out of the backfield. And so I think there is hidden potential with this team. And there were a couple of knocks against Mariota pre-draft, but one of them was that it was a question as to how accurate he could be down the field. And that is one instance where I think Dorial Green-Beckham could help him out a lot. That is where Dorial Green-Beckham can make money, is down the field, boxing out guys, jump balls, those deep touchdowns. I think that could be some sweet music. So if there's one place where you say, oh, well, I don't know about Marcus Mariota as a quarterback, we're not sure about his ability to throw down the field, I think Dorial Green-Beckham answers that. And so there is potential there. It's just I'm not certain about it. And there was also the question about how do I look at risk.
Yeah.
I have a pretty clear system in which okay, so there's always the chance that a guy drafted in the second or third round who doesn't fit my criteria could break out, right? There are the guys who are outliers or who didn't do well in college for some reason or another, or who just get into a great system in the NFL that kind of, like juices their potential, right? And so there's always the potential, but I have pretty strict kind of like investing rules. And so it's, I would prefer to take for instance, a third round guy that I felt pretty strongly about than a second round guy who was just kind of on the outside of my criteria.
Yeah.
That's just, and the same with like a guy in the fourth round. Historically, if you just look at one factor, draft position, you should take the guy who was drafted higher. But when I kind of bring in these other factors that I've researched and I believe have significance, then that changes the equation for me. And so my main desire, I guess thinking about from a risk-adjusted perspective, my main desire is always to make sure that I put the bat on the ball. That I give myself a chance of getting on base in some way.
Yeah.
And so people talk about go for Chris Conley because he's the high upside guy and you could hit a home run with him. For me, like the definition of hitting a home run with a third round pick is someone like John Brown. And it's for me, it's not a home run. It's just getting on base. I want to make sure I get on base with those other picks.
The one thing I will say about DGB is that his rookie production doesn't necessarily need to be huge for him to have a nice sell-high window after year one.
That's true.
So I mean, even though I'm fading him, I think there's a decent chance at some point he's either good, which there's a chance of that, or there's a good sell-high window. So I think it's a decent investment. I don't know.
That's true. And the thing is, so much also depends on how it is that you look at the markets. So, for instance, I'm more of a guy who kind of tries to figure out what the intrinsic value, what the production will be from an asset. Uh-huh. And I don't try to judge so much what the market value will be of players. Because the thing is, that is so variable league to league. And like there are certain dynasty leagues where it's just like it's hard to get a trade done, and basically you just kind of have to draft your guys and hope to pull off some trades at some point. But really, the draft is the main way to do it. And so you're right, like DGB's market value could be an avenue through which you could get value from him as an asset. But for me, I tend to really think about what is the production I could hope to get out of this guy if I had to put him in a starting lineup at some point.
Right. That makes sense.
That makes sense. So just to wrap up, we're going to crank out a few questions. And one of them you kind of already answered, so it won't take too long. First, Russell has a question for a league we're in. In a standard Dynasty PPR, Dez Bryant or Jordy, Jimmy, and Tevin?
Okay, so Dez on the one hand or Jordy, Jimmy, and Tevin. I think that the question would be, are you competing now or are you building? And, I mean, that's big, but, I would probably take the Jordy, Jimmy, and Tevin side. But I like Dez a lot. But also there are questions about his contract. There are questions about, like what happens if Romo has, like his third back injury and somehow has to retire? Like, are we going to trust, like, whoever is
Drew Bledsoe coming out of retirement?
Yeah, I mean, whoever happens to be the backup quarterback this year, if that's Dustin Vaughn, if that's Brandon Whedon, are we going to trust that guy to throw the ball to Dez? I think that situation is a little more tenuous. Now, granted, Jordy Nelson is going to be 30. He's coming off of hip surgery, but I like his ability. I still like Jimmy Graham as a top 5 tight end. I think he will be fed in Seattle, but I don't think he's going to have like the banquet of targets that he had in New Orleans. And obviously my love for Tevin Coleman tilts the trade for me.
I think, and okay, I put this out there on Twitter last night thinking this is going to be obvious. Everyone's going to go for the Jordy side. But I think this trade totally hinges on your opinion of Tevin Coleman. Because I like that side. But if you don't like him, then you're probably not doing that deal.
Yeah, and I think also a lot of it factors into like what is your tight end position and what is your running back position.
Yeah.
Like if you feel that you are a decent tight end away from having a solid championship run, Jordy Nelson I think is close enough to Des Bryant as a producer to make the upgrade at tight end worth the trade-off. And then Tevin Coleman could just be icing on the cake. And if he happens to do what the average Kyle Shanahan running back has done the last 7 years,
Yes.
that could be enough to win your league.
Woo woo! All in on the Tevin train, baby.
So what we just talked about with playing the market value or playing actual points, I think that the Jimmy and Jordy side, I think that's the one that scores the most points. Obviously, when you compare like Dez and replacement tight end and replacement running back versus Jordy and Tevin and Jimmy.
Right.
As far as like market value, none of those guys will ever have close to the market value of Dez.
No.
For the next like 5 years.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. And I think that gets back to the question, like, are you competing for a championship right now? Like, are these the guys that you're willing to go to war with for the next 3 years?
Right.
Because, as you said, you're never going to have a better opportunity than now to get these guys off your team for reasonable value.
Right. Yeah.
And then you kind of already answered this question, but maybe more of a broad scope on it. This is from Ravage FF, Patrick Sweeney, our friend. He said, how do you discern a player like Conley with plus metrics and limited production? So, I mean, I know you discussed Conley, you discussed production, but maybe just a broad scope real quick.
Yeah, so there are guys who have efficient production, but they don't have the amount. And so I think Stephen Hill is the poster child for this player,
Yeah.
right? And so for me, it's a question. Efficiency is great, but I think efficiency can also be overrated. So if there's a guy with efficiency who has volume with it, game on. But if a guy who's efficient but it's limited production, that's really questionable. And that type of player moving to the NFL historically doesn't have a track record of success. And so I tend to back away from that type of player. I want guys who were volume producers, whether they were efficient or inefficient. And I prefer the efficient, but I can't have efficiency by itself without the volume.
Yeah, that's how I view it as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the last question is just a fun one from Matt Riddle. He says, Q for Matt, what is it like being awesome? So you can answer that, and then I'll answer his question.
That might be the saddest question I've ever gotten. If I am meeting someone's criteria for awesomeness, then the world is not the place that we thought it was.
I feel like he put a gold star on your forehead as he said that. Question.
But I love Riddle. And MFL10 Maven, great guy. And it's if I'm awesome, a lot of it would have to do with just being in connection with the awesome RotoViz community. A great staff of writers there. I feel like there are new writers every week who are just pumping out fantastic content, and I'm really just thrilled to be a part of it.
While I agree, that was a very press conference answer.
Yeah,
but I agree with you.
Thank you.
His other question for me was, who is my favorite Matt? And I thought about this for a good minute, and
I'm not even my favorite Matt.
So my favorite Matt has to be the first fantasy quarterback I ever drafted, which
Hasselbeck?
is Matt Hasselbeck.
Wow!
that was the year that Sean Alexander got hurt, and I had Sean Alexander too. And so my fantasy career was definitely off to a rousing start.
Right.
Matt Hasselbeck, was it a late round quarterback?
I think he was fairly early.
That's a mid-round selection right there.
Wow. I guess that's a good note to end on, huh?
Yeah. So, and I like to apologize for all of my technical difficulties. My computer was screwing up, and then my phone was dying. I just wanted to throw things against the wall. So we definitely appreciate having you on, and just let everyone know where they can find you.
Sure. So I write for RotoViz, and just go to rotoviz.com. All of the articles are there. You can search for my articles just by clicking on the author button. And then I do the RotoViz radio podcast and the Numbers Game podcast, and so those come out every week. And you can just go to basically just whatever instrument you're using, just go to rotoviz.com/radio, and you can find us.
And you know where to find us here every week because you tune in, guys. We appreciate it. We have a YouTube channel, so if you want to like this video and subscribe, we'd really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you next week.
All right. See you later, guys.
Thanks.